everyone, and thanks for attending my presentation, The Mysteries of History. I'll be talking about how uncovering obscure type and design history has changed my path and perspective as a designer. I'm Olivia Kane, a graphic designer, letterer, and educator in New York City, and I'm super excited to share my insights with you today. So it all started several months ago when I began a new segment on the Weekly Typographic, a podcast by the League of Moveable Type that I co-host. The segment was called Nerd Alert, and my goal was to teach listeners about type and design history that just likely wasn't included in their formal education. So each week I had to research a new history topic, and I would do this deep dive into these intricate and nuanced stories that were super fascinating, yet very undershared. So I noticed that none of these stories really fit into a mainstream movement of their time. They weren't part of the Bauhaus movement or Art Deco or the Swiss International style. And as outliers, they were largely ignored by educators, popular discourse, and publications. But the more I pieced these stories together, the more I was able to understand cultural and aesthetic trends I previously had taken for granted, along with a whole new set of insights. So I'm excited to share an abridged version of a few of these stories I've uncovered in my informal research. So first, I'm discussing a topic I've been interested in for several years, and that's the survival of blackletter in contemporary culture. So blackletter was most common in Western Europe between 1150 and the 16th century, and its biggest legacy is actually with the Gutenberg Bible, and it was used as a type style in the first instance of movable type in the Western world. Other historical associations include calligraphy, Christianity, and German national identity. And my biggest question was, why are we still seeing blackletter in the 21st century? Blackletter is now commonly associated with subcultures like heavy metal or streetwear or hip-hop culture, but I want to know where the through line was from these historical references. Especially because I knew blackletter was highly politicized. During World War II, the Nazis appropriated blackletter for their propaganda because they considered it the most pure German type style. And so as the Nazis expanded, though, they weren't able to find blackletter at as many European foundries in other countries and were therefore pretty much forced to disown it, and then they labeled it Jewish and totally forgot about it. And so this was highly politicized, this type style. Like, how did we get to where it is today? How did it remain popular? And so to get to today's uses of blackletter, I think we should take a look at Mexico, where blackletter has been popularized for centuries. It was first used when Spanish colonizers arrived there, and it kind of maintained its association with Christianity, so it survived pretty well in the country, and it's seen still on signs throughout the country as well. And so in the 1940s, there was an influx of Mexican immigrants into America, specifically Southern California. And soon afterwards, Latino gangs were formed, and the first documentation of the gangs' graffiti tags show them in a blackletter style, very informal and all uppercase, which is quite different than how it was used previously for all of its history. So a few years later, there's the emergence of iron-on lettering, and one of the iron-on lettering styles is blackletter. And so, when there are gang members that passed away, they made memorial t-shirts, and for the memorial t-shirts, they used the blackletter iron-on lettering. Also at the same time across the country in New York, there was breakdancing groups forming called the B-Boy Crews. They also used the iron-on lettering blackletter type style to identify their crews, and that likely is what started the foundation for the use of blackletter in hip-hop culture. Blackletter then became associated with youth rebellion and counterculture, which explains its existence in heavy metal, and then a symbol for anti-establishment and individuality. And those associations were soon commodified by Juicy Couture, Kanye West, Supreme, high fashion brand Vetements. And the designer for this specific line of Kanye West merch that really blew up several years ago specifically said that he was trying to reference the Latino gang memorial t-shirts of the 70s and 80s. So most type and design history books are not tracking this history, likely because it's often associated with groups on the fringes of society. But to me, this is just definitely a missing link in design history and should definitely be shared with students, professionals, and educators. So another story that takes a long look at the past is the one of skeuomorphism. So a word that, as we can see here, is not new and is actually spiking in popularity. And after some research, I'm counting on it to be relevant for the years to come. The graphic design community is most familiar with skeuomorphism through its manifestation in digital design. It's typically defined as an interface style that was popularized by Apple, where digital elements resembled their recognizable real-life counterparts. Easy enough to digest when we're given examples of the iPhone's earliest interfaces. Each of these representations, though, are called skeuomorph. And skeuomorphs are part of a larger story that exists beyond the bounds of purely aesthetic trends. And no one really knows this story. So a skeuomorph is defined as an object or feature that imitates the design of an old artifact. And the earliest examples were found in ancient Greek architecture, but taking us to modern day, we're actually familiar with other physical skeuomorphs, like the plastic Adirondack chair, faux buckles on Velcro shoes for children, electric candles, ridges in plastic cutlery that resemble their metal counterparts that are totally not functional. Even today, electric cars have front cooling grills, which are not functional either because batteries don't get as hot as regular engines do. So sometimes skeuomorphs are meant to trick the viewer into reminding them of a more expensive material, the way faux leather belts do. But even more interesting is their purpose as a psychological comfort. And I think that actually gets glossed over when we talk about the trend of skeuomorphism. In the 1980s, skeuomorphism enters the digital realm, and Steve Jobs wanted computer icons to act as their real-life counterparts. So trash cans to delete files, floppy disk icons to be a metaphor for saving, and so on. When the 2000s came and our device displays became more advanced, Steve Jobs wanted things to look lickable. And in that sense, things are rendered as glossy with highlights and shadows liberally applied, things really rendered in a 3D way, contact lists that looked like an actual address book, notepad apps that imitated yellow legal paper, even with the tiny tears at the top, and this pebbled leather binding. And as much as people love to hate on skeuomorphism because it's no longer in trend, we have to give Apple credit for creating that psychological comfort that came with its interface. And alongside that comfort, an educational tool. So in 2007, there was little familiarity with how to navigate touchscreens and advanced interfaces. So who knows if the iPhone would have been such an accessible device without all the visual and auditory cues. And the skeuomorphism that existed then led to the digital metaphors that we're familiar with today that we don't even think twice about. And that's like the digital shopping cart that we use when we're online shopping, or the quick flash of a black screen on your iPhone to tell you you've taken a picture. So as technology becomes more advanced and more accessible, I think we should be learning from these skeuomorphic strategies of the past to create the comfort and ease for the future users of our digital products. Next is the largely under-recognized data portraits by W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois was a prolific author, civil rights activist, co-founder of the NAACP, and sociologist. These data portraits, which were made alongside a team of students and alumni from Atlanta University, were a set of 60 visualizations or infographics and were displayed at the World's Fair in Paris in 1900. They were meant to show the uplift of Black communities since slavery ended a few decades prior, and they were unprecedented in many ways. First, with their advancement of the social science field. In 1900, social science was scarily largely based on social Darwinism, the racist and classist way of thinking that claimed Caucasians were the superior race. But these data that actually used science and numbers that refuted social Darwinism. And that was like a first of its kind, which is mind-blowing. These infographics showed the Black community's literacy rates, ownership of property, and other statistics to academically prove their race was not inferior and just as capable. And this was the first time academic data was shared with a wide audience and the first visualizations of institutionalized racism. These were a push and pull because the Black community had relative success compared to where they were when slavery was still in existence. But they were still fighting discrimination and Jim Crow laws and incredibly marginalized in America. Another reason these portraits are so innovative is because there was limited work done in infographics before Du Bois. William Playfair and Florence Nightingale are notable examples, but aesthetically nowhere near as innovative as Du Bois's work. Which leads us to talk about the unprecedented aesthetic innovation with these pieces. These infographics are brightly colored, have almost a mechanical nature to them, even though they were hand done, and are total outliers in a visual sense at the turn of the century, because that's when Art Nouveau was at the height of its popularity. So this sans serif type looks really outrageous, and really looks ahead of its time, like it could belong in the Bauhaus movement or the De Stijl movement, which didn't come till several years later. Which you could speculate that since these were shown in Europe, that the data portraits could have influenced the creators of those movements. These data portraits did win a prize at the World's Fair, circulated for a couple years afterwards, then disappeared from the public eye and were largely ignored for decades. These portraits could have been invaluable references that we should have been learning from and building on. It's frustrating to know that they were largely ignored by seminal texts and popular discourse around graphic design history. There are so many missed opportunities that these could have been used as tools in education for communication design. But in the past couple of years, these portraits have been revived and kept alive in several ways. I have to largely credit the designer and educator Silas Monroe, who has given several lectures on the subject at Type at Cooper and Letterform Archive, and even assisted with the recent publication W.E.B. Du Bois Data Portraits, Visualizing Black America. Also, the Chicago-based artist Theaster Gates has been recreating the infographics in different materials and elevating them to gallery status imagery. And finally, the very talented type designer Trey Seals has been working to revive the sans serif type used in these portraits that I'm showing on the right, with his type family shown on the left, called William. Reshaping our design education to include works like these is just necessary. Finally, we're going to end with some typographic knowledge that is wildly ignored, but is inherent to our everyday life, and that is our numeral system. So our current system, with base 10, a decimal point, and 10 digits, is the Hindu Arabic system. In America, where we have a one-sided Eurocentric telling of history, this has actually been a largely ignored fact for a long time, and a fact that's not known by many. In a survey by Civic Science, a market research company surveyed Americans and asked, should schools in America teach Arabic numerals as part of their curriculum? And 56% of the respondents said no. That is what we're learning in our curriculum. It's just a sad result that comes from the lack of education around this subject and long-standing discrimination in the United States. But we live in a global village, and it's long overdue to shine light on the campaign for Hindu Arabic numerals that clashed but eventually overcame Europe's Roman numeral legacy. So Hindu Arabic numerals were developed between the 1st and 4th century by Indian mathematicians, not Arabic as commonly misnoted. The first literature was written in 825 AD by Al-Khwarizmi in Baghdad at the House of Wisdom. Because they were in Baghdad, that's where we get Arabic. Al-Khwarizmi had a Latinized name, which was algorithmi, which is where we got algorithm. So Al-Khwarizmi recorded the system, but it wasn't until 300 years later, in the 1200s, the famous Fibonacci found the literature, got it translated, and brought it to the European population, where he tried to make it popular. It seemed like a more logical system to him then, and it obviously is. As we can see here, trying to multiply Roman numerals seems really hard. Or what about trying to align them in columns for accounting? That just doesn't work with Roman numerals. But because of the Roman Empire, Roman numerals were status quo, and so they were met with a lot of resistance when they were asked to change to this new Hindu Arabic system. So Europeans kind of made up all these reasons to resist it. Some Europeans thought it was going to be unchristian. Others said that it was going to be too easy to change accounting numbers with the Hindu Arabic system because you could just add zeros to numbers and make them bigger. But by the 1500s, typography helped propel it into a commonplace system. So then we should ask ourselves, when do we use Roman numerals today? Why should we use them? Well, they're still used in some standards, like to use in chapter numbers for books, page indexes or appendices for reference books, and in reference books they're typically shown in lowercase, which are called Romanettes because they're cute. Roman numerals are also seen in names and clocks as well. In fact, in 2010, luxury brand Piaget replaced Hindu Arabic numerals with Roman numerals on their watch faces and saw an increase in sales. A graphic designer may want to incorporate Roman numerals if they want to add melodrama to their text. Louis XIV in Roman numerals versus Louis XIV with Hindu Arabic numerals feels just different, and the same with Rocky IV. The Super Bowl also uses Roman numerals with the exception of Super Bowl 50, which used Hindu Arabic numerals because the written Super Bowl L was not appealing to the marketers involved. Another case where typographic history is juicy and complex, but gets overlooked and understudied. By all means, we need to give credit where credit is due. The Hindu Arabic numeral system had to fight an uphill battle. So that wraps it up. If you want to hear any more on these subjects, they're part of past episodes of the Weekly Typographic. As type users and designers, we are responsible for how we reuse aesthetic motifs from the past. It's time to reshape our design history education to include stories from a more global perspective and to stop discounting these lesser known but equally important anecdotes. By sharing my experience, I hope to have sparked some curiosity in you today and have shown the need to reshape and rethink our design history education as we pass it on to the next generation of creators. Thank you.